The Duke's Sister and the Radical Poet. Chapter 1. The Gilded Cage. Lady Rosamond Carvel knew the precise weight of her station. It was the weight of the family silver, polished to a blinding gleam on the long dining table. It was the weight of her gowns, layers of silk, an intricate embroidery designed not for comfort, but for presentation. Most of all, it was the weight of her brother's expectations. A pressure so constant and familiar it felt like the very air of Averton House. The Duke of Aldridge, her brother Julian, was not a cruel man. He was, however, a man utterly defined by his duty. At 29, 6 years her senior, he carried the dukedom with a solemnity that had aged him beyond his years. Their father's death from a sudden fever when Rosamond was just 18 had thrust the weight of their ancient lineage onto both their shoulders. Julian bore the title and the estates. Rosamond bore the burden of being its most valuable unplaced piece. "Lord Fencroft is in town," Julian announced one evening, not looking up from the letter he was reading. They were in the smaller drawing room, a space marginally less intimidating than the staterooms. A fire crackled in the grate, chasing away the November chill. Rosamond sat with a book in her lap, though she had not turned a page in 20 minutes. "Is he?" she replied, her voice carefully neutral. "He will be at the Marchmain ball. I expect you to save him a dance. 2, perhaps." He finally looked at her, his eyes the same shade of hazel as her own, but where hers often held a private spark of amusement, his were perpetually assessing. "He is an excellent match, Rosamond. Ancient name, estates in Northumberland are sound, and he has a keen interest in veterinary science. A solid man." Rosamond translated this without effort. "Dull, proud, and he will expect you to manage his household and produce an heir without a single thought of your own." Lord Fencroft was 45, widowed, and possessed of a reputation for piety so severe it bordered on the fanatical. He would not appreciate a wife who read poetry by candlelight and harboured thoughts she was never supposed to utter. "He is also, I am told, a great patron of the evangelical movement," Rosamond said, keeping her eyes on her book. "I wonder if he allows dancing at his own gatherings." Julian sighed, the sound heavy with the patience he believed he showed her. "You quibble. You find fault with every eligible gentleman I present. You are 24, Rosamond. It is time." Time. The word was a cage, time to stop scribbling in her private journal, time to stop sneaking volumes of radical philosophy from her father's old library, time to accept that her life was not her own, she was a piece on a board and Julian was the player. "I am not refusing him, Julian, I am merely observing." Her brother folded his letter with a decisive snap. "Observe less, dance more, and for God's sake try to look as if you are enjoying it. Your air of distraction is off-putting." He rose, signifying the conversation was over. "The Marchmain ball. Friday next. Wear the green silk." After he left, Rosamond sat motionless for a long time. The firelight played across the room, glinting off the gilded picture frames and the polished legs of the satinwood furniture. Everything here was beautiful, perfect, and suffocating. She looked down at the book in her lap. It was a collection of pastoral poems, harmless enough. But tucked within its pages was a folded sheet of paper, covered in her own small, fierce handwriting. It was a poem. Not about shepherds and daffodils, but about a child she had seen foraging for coal on the common near their country estate, his bare feet blue with cold. It spoke of the contrast between the warm, well-fed halls of the great house and the huddled cottages in its shadow. It was angry. It was truthful. It was, Julian would say, entirely improper. A week later, after another round of inane small talk with the dour Lord Fencroft at the Marchmain ball, Rosamond's frustration curdled into something harder. She had done her duty. She had danced. She had smiled. She had listened to him expound on the moral failings of the poor with a complacency that made her blood run cold. Back in her room, she did not ring for her maid. Instead, she lit a branch of candles and pulled out the sheaf of poems she had accumulated over the last 2 years. They were a secret history of her soul. There was one about a young maid she'd had to dismiss for a minor infraction, knowing the girl's family would starve. There was one about the gilded carriages that splashed mud on the pedestrians in the London streets. And there were more, sharper ones, about the lords and ladies who sat in Parliament and passed laws that benefited their own pockets, while children worked 16 hours a day in mills. A dangerous, thrilling idea, long dormant, began to unfurl. What if the world could hear these words, not as the scribblings of Lady Rosamond Carvel, but as a voice from within the darkness she described? She would not use her name. She would use none. She would be a ghost, a whisper of dissent. The next day, she put her plan into action with a composure that surprised even herself. She disguised herself in her maid's plainest cloak and bonnet and walked to a small, dingy print shop in a district of London she had only ever glimpsed from a carriage window. The smell of ink and damp paper filled the air. The printer, a gruff, pragmatic man named Mr. Thorne, looked at her fine gloves and hesitated. "It's unusual. A lady coming here alone," he said, his eyes narrow. "It is not a lady, Mr. Thorne," Rosamond said, her voice low and steady. "It is an author, one who wishes to remain entirely anonymous. The name on the pamphlet will be Lyra. Can you do it? A small run, 50 copies." He looked at the manuscript. The poems were short, powerful, and incendiary. He could be shut down for printing them, but they were also magnificent. He saw the glint of a gold coin she placed on the counter. 50 copies of Lyra's verses, he muttered, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Aye, miss, I can do that." Weeks later, a slim, unassuming pamphlet began to appear on the bookstalls of Holywell Street and in the windows of a few daring print shops. It was titled simply, "Whispers from the Margins." No one knew who Lyra was, but her voice, clear and furious and full of pity, had been uncaged. Chapter 2. The Voice in the Darkness. Silas Blackwood had not expected to find anything of worth in a London drawing-room. He had come to the capital at the behest of a group of reformers, men who believed that change could be wrought through pamphlets, petitions, and polite pressure. Silas believed in a different kind of change. He believed in the cleansing fire of truth. He was a poet, though he despised the fey, romantic connotations of the word. He was a truth-teller. His own work, published under his name, was a scathing indictment of the system that kept men like him, the son of a Lancashire weaver, in poverty while bloated aristocrats gorged on the nation's wealth. He was handsome in a stark, unpolished way, with dark hair that fell across his brow and eyes the colour of a winter sea. He dressed plainly, his coat well cut but of durable cloth, a quiet rebellion against the silks and satins of the ton. He moved through the fashionable world like a spy in enemy territory, observing, cataloguing, and despising. It was at Lady Bessborough's notorious salon that he first heard the whisper. "Have you seen it?" a young dandy was asking a friend, his voice dripping with affected boredom. "It's the most shocking little thing. All about, well, about us, I suppose. Calls us parasites." "A radical, then," the friend yawned. "A poet, they say. Lyra. A woman, perhaps. The passion is quite feminine." Silas's attention, which had been drifting over the glittering assembly, snapped into focus. He procured a copy of Whispers from the Margins the very next day. He read it in a single, breathless sitting in his cheap lodgings off Covent Garden. The poems were not the well-meaning, sentimental verse of a charitable lady. They were forged in the same fire that burned in him. They knew the texture of hunger. They saw the casual cruelty of privilege. One poem, titled "The Diamond and the Dust," compared a duchess's gemstones to the dust that filled the lungs of the servants who polished them. It was brilliant, brutal, and breathtakingly accurate. For the first time in years, Silas Blackwood felt something he had almost forgotten. Hope. He was not alone. There was another voice crying in the wilderness. A few nights later, he found himself at a literary soirée hosted by a minor publisher. He was holding forth, as was his wont, on the moral rot at the heart of the British aristocracy. His audience was a mix of fascinated young ladies and uncomfortable gentlemen. "They speak of duty, of noblesse oblige," he said, his voice a low, compelling rumble. "It is a cloak for their greed. They see the suffering of the millions, and they turn away to their balls, their hunts, their petty intrigues. They are not our leaders. They are our parasites. The only honest voice in England today does not belong to any lord in Parliament. It belongs to an unknown, a shadow. It belongs to Lyra." Her poem, The Diamond and the Dust, should be branded on the heart of every duke and duchess in the land. Across the room, Lady Rosamond Carvel felt the world tilt on its axis. She had been coaxed to this gathering by a friend, a haven of boredom marginally preferable to an evening with Julian. She had been half listening to the poet's diatribe with a mixture of shame and thrilling recognition. He was describing her world, her brother, her very life. He was describing her. And then he had spoken her name. Her name, Lyra. He had praised her words, her secret soul, as the only honest voice in England. Her cheeks burned, her heart hammered against her ribs. She stared at the man, this radical poet with the burning eyes and the scornful mouth, and felt a terrifying pull. He was the enemy of everything she was. He would look at her, in her green silk gown and Carvel pearls, and see only the parasite he so eloquently condemned. But in that moment, he was also the only person in the world who truly understood her. Later, she found herself standing by the refreshment table, her hand trembling as she reached for a glass of orgeat. She felt, rather than saw, him approach. "You looked as if you needed that," he said. His voice was softer now, the public declamation gone. Rosamond turned. Up close, he was even more striking. His face was all sharp angles and strong lines, his eyes a startling blue-green. There was no deference in his gaze, only a frank, assessing intelligence that made her feel utterly seen and utterly vulnerable. "The air in here is rather close," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "It is the air of 100 perfumes trying to mask a single unpleasant truth," he said, a wry smile touching his lips. "Forgive my earlier outburst. I have a habit of boring on about my obsessions. I am Silas Blackwood." I know who you are," she said. "Your reputation precedes you, Mr. Blackwood. The radical poet." His smile widened, becoming less guarded. "A title I wear with more pride than most men wear their inherited ones. And you are?" Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She could not tell him. She could not be Lady Rosamond Carvel, sister to the Duke of Alderridge, the very embodiment of the diamond he had so brilliantly excoriated. She would become, in his eyes, a hypocrite of the highest order. The connection she felt, this terrifying spark of recognition, would be instantly extinguished by disgust. "I am no one of consequence," she said, a desperate half-truth. "Just a visitor. I was very struck by what you said about the poet, Lyra. You truly believe her work is honest." He looked at her more closely, as if trying to place her. Her evasion was rude, a breach of etiquette, but he didn't seem to mind. He seemed intrigued. "I believe it is the most important verse to be published in a decade," he said, his voice intense. "It is not the polite whining of a genteel soul. It is the cry of someone who has looked into the abyss of this world's injustice and refused to look away. I would give a great deal to know who she is, to thank her." Rosamond's heart ached. "You are looking at her." The words were on her lips, a physical pressure, but fear and shame held them back. "Perhaps she values her anonymity," she said softly. "Perhaps she has much to lose." Silas's gaze softened. "A fair point. The world is not kind to truth-tellers, especially if they are women. Still, I shall continue to praise her from the rooftops. She deserves that much. He was called away then by an acquaintance, but not before giving her a long, curious look. "I hope we meet again," he said, and it was not a polite pleasantry. It was a statement of intent. Rosamond fled the soiree moments later, her mind a whirlwind of terror and exhilaration. She had spoken to him. He had looked at her not as a piece of aristocratic fluff, but as a person capable of understanding. And he had praised her work, her true self, without knowing it. It was the most intoxicating and most dangerous moment of her life. Chapter 3. A Dangerous Correspondence. They did meet again. The season was young, and Silas Blackwood, for all his radicalism, was a sought-after commodity in certain liberal-leaning circles. He was a novelty, a genuine article of the people who could speak with eloquence and passion. Rosamond, for her part, began to accept invitations she would normally have declined, her eyes scanning every room for a glimpse of dark hair and a starkly handsome face. Their second meeting was at a small intellectual gathering hosted by a publisher's wife. This time, Julian was not there to watch her. The conversation was lively, and Silas sought her out almost immediately. "The woman of no consequence," he greeted her, a smile in his eyes. "I was hoping you would be here." "I am surprised you remember me," she said, her pulse quickening. "I remember everyone who looks at me as if I am both a curiosity and a threat," he replied, amused. "Most ladies here either flutter their eyelashes or cut me dead. You looked at me like I was a puzzle you were trying to solve." Over the following weeks, a strange, intense friendship blossomed. They walked in less fashionable parks, where the risk of encountering Julian or his ilk was smaller. They talked for hours in the corners of crowded rooms. He lent her books by Tom Paine and Mary Wollstonecraft. She, terrified of discovery, could only offer him her thoughts, her quick mind, her carefully passed opinions. She never spoke of her family, her home, her life beyond these stolen moments. She let him believe she was a poor relation, a genteel companion perhaps, a woman of intelligence and feeling, but with no connection to the world he despised. He, in turn, opened a window onto a world she had only imagined. He spoke of his childhood in Lancashire, the grim life in the weaving villages, the death of his father from a wasting disease brought on by the damp and toil. He spoke of his mother, who had taken in sewing to give him an education. He spoke of his belief in a world where a person's worth was determined by their contribution, not their birth. "Your Lyra understands that," he said one afternoon as they walked along the Serpentine. A cold wind whipped across the water, and Rosamond pulled her plain woolen cloak tighter. In her poem, The Reckoning, she speaks of a day when accounts will be settled not by gold, but by human worth. It is a revolutionary thought, dressed in the language of Scripture. Rosamond felt a flush of pride so intense it was painful. "She is fortunate to have such an advocate," she said quietly. "It is not advocacy," he said, stopping to look at her. "It is recognition. When I read her, I feel less alone. Does that sound foolish?" "No," she whispered, her hazel eyes meeting his. "It sounds like the most honest thing in the world." It was in that moment, standing by the grey, wind-swept lake, that the nature of their friendship shifted. The intellectual kinship they shared deepened, became something warmer, more precarious. He began to look at her not just as a fascinating mind, but as a woman. He noticed the way a strand of hair escaped her bonnet, the way her eyes lit up when she argued a point, the curve of her lips when she smiled at one of his sallies. Rosamond, for her part, was falling in love with the man who would despise her if he knew the truth. She loved his passion, his integrity, his unshakable moral compass. He was everything her world was not, real, honest, and alive. Every moment with him was a stolen treasure, and every moment was shadowed by the guillotine blade of discovery. Meanwhile, whispers from the margin was causing a stir. Julian found a copy on a table in his club and threw it into the fire with a snort of disgust. "Rabble-rousing nonsense," he declared to his friends. "This Lyra is likely some bitter spinster with a grudge against the world." Rosamond, hearing this report from a friend, felt a cold satisfaction. Her brother had no idea the spinster was sitting across from him at the breakfast table. But Silas's public praise was growing bolder. He wrote an essay for a reformist journal titled The Voice of Lyra, in which he analysed her poems and hailed her as the moral conscience of the nation. He spoke of her at public meetings. He was, unwittingly, building a pedestal for the very woman who was falling in love with him in secret. The pressure on Rosamond was becoming immense. One evening, as they sat in a quiet corner of a bookshop that Silas frequented, he took her hand. His touch sent a shiver through her. "I do not even know your name," he said softly. "You are always my mysterious friend. I have told you everything about myself. You have told me nothing." Rosamond's heart seized. "My name is Rosamond," she whispered, giving him the one truth she could. It was her name, after all. "Rosamond," he repeated, as if tasting it. "It suits you. It has an old, romantic feel, like a lady in a tower, waiting to be rescued." He smiled, unaware of the profound truth in his jest. "But why the secrecy? Are you a runaway heiress? A princess in disguise?" "I am just someone who has a great deal to lose," she said, her voice tight with unshed tears. "Please, Silas, do not ask for more than I can give." His smile faded, replaced by a look of deep concern. He lifted her hand and pressed a gentle kiss to her gloved fingers. "Then I will wait," he said. "I will wait until you are ready to trust me." The kiss, light as it was, burned through her glove. She wanted to tell him everything. She wanted to throw herself on his mercy, to beg him to see her, the woman who wrote the poems, not the title she was born to. But the fear was too great. The chasm between them seemed, in that moment, as vast and unbridgeable as the distance between a palace and a poorhouse. Chapter 4. The Reckoning. The truth, when it came, was not a confession. It was a catastrophe. Rosamond had been growing bolder. The success of her poems and her love for Silas had stirred a reckless courage in her. She had given Mr. Thorne a new, shorter poem for a broadsheet, one that directly satirized a recent, highly publicized ball given by the Duchess of Granville. It was sharper, more personal than her previous work. It was a mistake. The poem caused a minor scandal. People in the ton began to whisper, to speculate. Who was this Lyra, who seemed to know the intimate details of their world? The Duchess of Granville was furious and demanded the printer be found. Mr. Thorne, faced with the threat of prosecution and ruin, panicked. When a well-dressed gentleman, acting on behalf of an offended lord, pressed him, he crumbled. He did not know the author's real name, he swore it, but he could describe her. A young lady, tall, with hazel eyes and dark hair, fine gloves, a cultured voice, an air of breeding that no simple cloak could hide. The description, whispered in drawing rooms and clubs, eventually reached the ears of the Duke of Aldridge. It reached him at the same time a rumour did, that the radical poet Silas Blackwood had been seen in the company of an unidentified young woman of similar description. Julian was not a stupid man. He began to watch his sister. The confrontation occurred on a bleak December afternoon. Rosamond was preparing to go out, to meet Silas for what she hoped would be a final, desperate confession. She could not live with the deceit any longer. She would tell him everything, and pray that his love for her was stronger than his hatred for her class. She was stopped in the marble hallway by her brother's voice. "Going out, Rosamond?" She turned. Julian stood there, his face pale with a fury she had never seen before. In his hand, he held a crumpled broadsheet. "I have just had a most interesting conversation with Lord Cherwell," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. He tells me that the radical rabble-rouser, Blackwood, has been seen with a woman who matches the description of the slut who has been publishing filth about our friends and family. He took a step closer. Imagine my horror when I realized that description also matched my own sister. Rosamond felt the blood drain from her face. There was no point in denial. The look in his eyes told her he already knew. "Is it true?" he demanded. "Are you Lyra?" Rosamond lifted her chin. The years of silence, of duty, of hidden fury, coalesced into a single defiant point. "Yes," she said, "I am." The word hung in the air like a pistol shot. Julian's face contorted. He took a step forward and struck her across the face. It was not a hard blow, but the shock of it, the sheer violation, was worse than any pain. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her stinging cheek. "You have disgraced this family," he hissed. "You have shamed our name. Our father would rather have seen you dead than scribbling like a common hack for the amusement of the mob." Before Rosamond could speak, the heavy front door knocker sounded. The sound was thunderous in the charged silence. A moment later, a footman appeared, looking flustered. "Your Grace, a Mr. Blackwood is here. He insists on seeing Lady Rosamond. He says it is urgent." Silas. He had come. He must have heard the rumours too. He had come to find his Rosamond, the woman of no consequence. Julian's eyes blazed with a terrible, triumphant light. "Show him in," he commanded. "Let him see the truth with his own eyes." Rosamond stood frozen, her world crumbling around her. Silas was ushered into the marble hall. He looked from Julian's furious face to Rosamond's pale, stricken one and the red mark on her cheek. His expression shifted from confusion to cold, hard understanding. "Rosamond," he said, his voice stripped of all warmth. He looked at the opulent hall, the liveried servants, the Duke in his finely tailored coat. "What is this?" "This," Julian said, his voice dripping with contempt, "is my sister, Lady Rosamond Compl, the woman you have been consorting with, the anonymous gutter poet you have been praising from the rooftops. Look at her, Blackwood. Look at the parasite in the silk gown." Silas's gaze was fixed on Rosamond. It was not the gaze of a lover. It was the gaze of a man who has been betrayed. The winter sea eyes were now the colour of a storm. "The woman of no consequence," he said, his voice hollow. "The poor relation. It was all a lie." "No," Rosamond whispered, stepping towards him. "Silas, please. My name is Rosamond. That is the truth. The poems are the truth. That is who I am." "Who you are," he repeated, a bitter laugh escaping him. "You are the sister of a duke. You are the living embodiment of everything you wrote against. You sat in your fine drawing room and imagined the suffering of the poor. You are not a voice from the margins. You are a tourist in the darkness." His words were knives, each one finding its mark. "I praised you," he continued, his voice rising with a pain that mirrored her own. "I held you up as a beacon of honesty, and all the while you were lying to my face, playing a game." "It was not a game," Rosamond cried, tears streaming down her face. "I wrote those poems because I saw it from my window, from my carriage. I am part of this world, but I am not of it, not in my heart. You know me, Silas. You know my mind, my soul. The poems came from there, not from my title." Julian watched the scene with a cold, satisfied sneer. "Your little revolutionary doesn't seem to appreciate your efforts, Rosamond. He sees you for what you are, a noblewoman who played at being a rebel." Silas flinched at the word, noblewoman. He looked at Rosamond, at the pearls at her throat, the fine wool of her gown, the mark of his class on her cheek. He saw the gilded cage, but he also saw the bars. He saw the woman he had held hands with by the Serpentine, the woman who argued with him about justice, the woman who looked at him with love in her hazel eyes. The silence stretched, taut as a wire. I loved you, he said, and the past tense was a fresh wound. I loved the woman I thought you were, a woman of courage and fire who had nothing to lose. But you had everything to lose, didn't you, Lady Rosamond? Your place in this world, your brother's approval, your precious station. I was afraid, she confessed, her voice breaking. I was a coward. I was afraid of this very moment, of losing you. You cannot lose what you never truly had, he said, his voice quiet with defeat. He turned away from her, his shoulders rigid. He looked at the Duke. You have my word, Your Grace. I will never seek out your sister again. This mistake is over. He walked towards the door. Rosamond felt a scream building inside her. Silas, wait, please, the poems. They are real. I am real. The woman who wrote them is standing here begging you to see her. He paused, his hand on the door handle. He did not turn around. The woman who wrote them, he said, his voice muffled, is the woman I loved, but she does not exist. He opened the heavy door and walked out into the grey December afternoon, leaving it gaping open behind him. The cold air swept into the hall, but Rosamond felt nothing. She stood in the ruins of her life, the truth finally, brutally told. She had lost her brother's respect, her place in society, and most devastatingly, the love of the only man who had ever truly seen her. The gilded cage was still there, but now it was empty. She was utterly, completely alone. Julian's voice cut through the silence. You will go to your room. You will not leave this house without my permission. When the season is over, you will go to our aunt's estate in the country, and you will stay there until I decide what is to be done with you. Rosamond did not reply. She walked past him, up the grand staircase, her footsteps echoing in the hollow silence. In her room, she did not weep. She sat by the window and watched the darkness fall over London, the city where she had found her voice and lost her heart. She thought of his words. She does not exist. But she was wrong. Lyra existed. And as the first stars pricked the velvet sky, Rosamond Carvel made a silent vow. She did not know if love could survive the truth, but she knew with a certainty that burned brighter than any pain that her voice would. She would not be silenced. She would write again. And if Silas Blackwood never spoke to her, never read another line, it did not matter. She would write for the child in the coal fields, for the dismissed maid, for all the voiceless souls in the shadows. For in the end, it was not the Duke's sister, nor the radical poet's lover, who would have the last word. It would be Lyra, the end. As this story draws to its final breath, I want to thank you, truly, for walking every step of this journey, for lingering in its silences, for feeling its heartache, and for believing, even in its darkest moments, that love might yet prevail. If this tale has stirred something deep within you, if it has reminded you of the quiet power of devotion, resilience, and hope, then I invite you to stay. Subscribe and step with us into many more worlds where love is tested, hearts are broken, and always something beautiful endures. Your next story is already waiting.